President Donald Trump says the United States will strike inside Venezuela, quote, very soon. He made the statement while speaking to members of the U.S. military on a Thanksgiving phone call. Have a listen.
And in recent weeks, you've been working to deter Venezuelan drug traffickers, of which there are many. Of course, there aren't too many coming in by sea anymore, if you probably noticed that. We'll be starting to stop them by land also. The land is easier, but that's going to start very soon. We warn them, stop sending poison to our country.
The U.S. has killed more than 80 people in strikes on alleged drug trafficking boats in the Caribbean. The administration has offered no proof that the vessels were actually carrying drugs. Alejandro Velasco is a historian and associate professor at NYU. He's joining us from Amherst, Massachusetts. Thank you so much for being here. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Let's get into this. President Trump says the U.S. is preparing to stop Venezuelan drug traffickers by land very soon. How seriously should we be taking this language? And what does it signal about a possible shift in strategy?
That's a great question. The reality is that over the past 2 weeks, what we've seen is very contradictory discourse coming out of the White House and, in fact, other members of the administration. We have some hawkish elements every day seeming to either leak or directly state that they seek greater intervention in Venezuela directly. And of course, we just had the recent naming designation of the so-called Cartel de los Soles as another escalation into that end. On the other hand, Trump has also said that he's not really interested in necessarily in intervention. He wants to talk with Maduro. Maybe there's room for negotiation. So, right now, this all seems like a part of a larger psychological operations game, warfare, to see if Maduro breaks.
The U.S. now has more than a dozen warships and 15,000 troops in the region. How unusual is this level of force around Venezuela, and what message is Washington trying to send?
It's unprecedented is what it is. Certainly it's the largest deployment outside of planned military exercises in the 21st century. And even in the 20th century, it was an unusual deployment for this part of the region. I think what it says, obviously, is that the United States is prepared to intervene. The real question is whether the person who has ultimate say in whether that happens, which is President Trump, has in fact agreed to do so. But he's positioned to be there, and to some extent, the fact that there is this massive deployment commits some kind of intervention, because without something changing in Venezuela, this might actually be seen as a victory for the Maduro government.
Well, while we're talking about things changing in Venezuela, the administration here has just designated Maduro and his allies as members of a foreign terrorist organization. What does that actually mean in practical terms?
It basically gives the administration more legal leeway to take actions that might not otherwise be permissible in a context of war or pre-war, if you want to call it that. It means that it has a greater arsenal and repertoire of action and engagement for people that it considers or designates to be part of this cartel. It also means that it doesn't have to provide nearly as much information, either certainly to Congress, which it already hasn't provided enough information, but to the judicial system. And so it allows for a greater range of action than has been the case.
Can you tell me, how are Venezuelans viewing this build-up? And what impact could Trump's comments have on Maduro's domestic standing?
Venezuelans have been through a lot, not just over the last 5, 10, 15 years, but really over the last 25, 30 years. The state of heightened crisis has almost been a kind of status quo. And so Venezuelans are going about their lives. Obviously, my friends and family who are there are anxious or concerned about potential actions. Some of them are moving if they feel like they're close to military targets. They're finding elsewhere to stay. But for most people, it's it's getting into the holiday season, and so they're trying to to live their lives. But it has also had significant impact because the U.S. has also said that airlines should not fly into or in Venezuelan air territory, and so many airlines have not canceled flights, and so that's affected the plans of many Venezuelans that they had, especially for holidays, to travel. And so it's definitely an impact.
Okay, we'll leave it there for now, but let's see what happens next. Thank you for breaking it down, Alejandro Velasco. Appreciate it.
New this morning, President Trump says the U.S. military will start targeting alleged drug trafficking networks inside Venezuela very soon.
We've almost stopped. It's about 85% stopped by sea. You probably noticed that. People aren't wanting to be delivering by sea. And we'll be starting to stop them by land also. The land is easier, but that's going to start very soon. We warn them, stop sending poison to our country.
Thousands of U.S. troops and more than a dozen warships are in the Caribbean in the waters off Venezuela. You're seeing the strikes, some of those strikes that have happened in the waters off of Venezuela. They've been carrying out those deadly strikes for weeks now. Joining me now, CNN senior military analyst and former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Admiral James Stavridis. Thank you so much for being here this morning. All right, President Trump is saying that he will soon stop the Venezuelan drug trafficking by land. Do you read that to mean he's talking about troops on the ground? I mean, what else could it mean?
I think it sounds like boots on the ground. I was just reading an email I got from a Vietnam War veteran who said the four most frightening words he can imagine a president saying are, "The land is easier," meaning once you start putting boots on the ground, it gets a lot harder than dropping bombs from the air or launching missiles from the sea. And I know that, having launched a lot of missiles from the sea, the danger is when you put troops ashore. So what's the president talking about? I don't know. I hope it would be very limited kind of incursions, perhaps against drug labs, maybe going after some leadership targets. I could sketch those out in greater depth, Sarah. But frankly, we need to be very cautious about anything that involves putting U.S. boots on the ground in Venezuela. I hope the Congress gets involved with this. Final thought, sometimes people look back to the 1980s and 90s when we invaded Panama and kind of took that country and took the leader, Noriega, a very successful operation called Just Cause. Here's the problem. Panama is a tiny country. Venezuela, it's twice the size of California. It would be a big military operation.